Good afternoon, and welcome back to USTA Florida's Here to Serve podcast. My name is Laura Bowen, and I'm the Executive Director at USTA Florida. Today's episode is all about breaking barriers, and my three guests have a lot to share on this topic. Joining me today for his third time on our podcast is Mr. George Henry, who currently serves as our Director of Tennis at Play Tennis Gainesville. As those of you who've joined the podcast before will know, George brings a wealth of experience in tennis to USTA Florida. He has a stellar background in tennis management and teaching. He served as a high-level instructor in Miami and Delray Beach, and he's coached college tennis programs in both Florida and Pennsylvania. 2 years ago, I originally met George after reading his thesis about increasing African American tennis player participation at selected HBCU. That thesis and my conversation with George laid the foundation for USTA Florida's HBCU initiative. Joining George on the podcast today is Ken Collins. Ken also is a full-time tennis professional at our Play Tennis Gainesville location. And like George, Ken brings a wealth of experience in tennis to USTA Florida and our podcast. Ken actually earned a full tennis scholarship to attend Grambling State University. His talent and dedication led him to be an all-conference player for the Southwest Athletic Conference in both doubles and singles for 4 consecutive years. After college, Ken played professional tennis on the satellite circuit. He's actually coached a number of players on the tour, coaching and traveling in over 30 countries. Today, as I said, he works mainly at our Gainesville location, and he has a lot to share about what we can do to open more doors for Black tennis players in the state of Florida. Finally, our last guest on the podcast today is Glenn Gilliam. Glenn is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Althea Film National Screening Tour and Educational Outreach. Glenn is a marketing and advertising veteran turned advocate for documentaries chronicling the legacy of Black achievement and contribution often overlooked. Glenn has been a tireless advocate for Althea Gibson and promoting her legacy in tennis. Today's conversation covers a lot of ground. It's a long episode of the podcast, but I hope you'll stay tuned for the entire episode as we talk about a lot of important ways that we can expand access to tennis and create more equitable opportunities as we break more barriers for everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, feel free to leave a comment or a question for us on our social media. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of fun today, so thank you.
Good. How about you?
George, I think this is our anniversary. It's our third consecutive podcast in February, so always a pleasure to have you, and I'm really grateful to have Ken and Glenn here joining us as well. So we'll have to kind of make this maybe an annual tradition next year and make sure that we all reconvene in 2026. But, I really wanted to start today's episode a little bit differently and ask each of you what the term breaking barriers means to you. And George, since you're my longtime guest and my anchor, I thought I'd start with you and ask, what does breaking barriers mean to you?
Breaking barriers. First of all, for me, it means change. Change, breakthrough, new beginnings.
It's a really great definition, and I think that we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So good. That's a good kickoff. Ken, how about you? What does breaking barriers mean to you?
Well, we grew up, in America, believing in the American dream. If you work hard, keep your nose to the grindstone, everything works out. But as a young man, as a young Black man, I saw that everything wasn't the same for everybody. right? If you're a woman or a black person in this country, sometimes you're going to have to break down walls or break barriers. And it's not necessarily for you, but for the people coming from behind you. So
That's a great perspective. Glenn, how about you? When you think of breaking barriers, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, both George and Ken really kind of summed it up. I guess, that perspective is different for folks maybe of different hue. Obviously, we know about the American dream. We've sacrificed a lot to see it work out for everybody, but breaking barriers, I think, has become really important for me because there have been so many that haven't been acknowledged. I think change, from what George was saying, new beginnings, those are idealistic thoughts about barriers being broken, but it is definitely about transformation. Hopefully, that is what we're striving for.
Oh, I love that. Change, transformation, really, moving forward, all really good themes for our podcast today, and recognizing those that do break barriers, I think, which is amazing. So I asked you that.
I'm sorry, can I just say, should I be wearing glasses? It seems like am I the odd person out here?
Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, it's all good.
Well, for those listening, they all know now that 3 of us have some visual barriers that we have to overcome every day.
Yes, we do.
You guys just look way more intelligent than me right now.
I don't know. Well, let's turn to tennis. I asked you a little bit of an esoteric question, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into tennis, since that's what we all do and have a passion for. So when you think about the sport of tennis today, I want to know, what barriers have we already broken and what barriers still remain that we need to work to overcome? And so, George, I'm going to start with you again, and then Ken, I'd like to hear your perspective on this also.
I mean, for me, tennis barriers, really, the barriers on the court, off the court. And a lot of us look at it like, hey, it's just what we do, in playing tennis and being a professional. But I think administratively, as we work after our careers in tennis, playing to go ahead and break barriers business-wise. Because there's a big economy that a lot of us don't even understand or even realize that is out there after you play.
Great perspective. How about you, Ken? When you think about tennis, what barriers have we already broken, and what's still there that we need to maybe overcome?
Well, we're looking at this a different way, but I think the barriers we've ones that come to mind is that we're all allowed to play the tournaments that we weren't allowed to play before while the ATA was brought up. The barrier I think we still have to go is in our own community, getting them to understand that this is not just a sport for rich people, but it's something that can enhance their lives, by playing scholarships. So the barrier is just inside our own community to get them to understand what tennis can do for them.
Yeah, I think that's amazing perspective from both of you. Is sometimes there's barriers that are put up that other people put up in front of us, and sometimes we have our own barriers. I think about that a lot. Is like, what barriers or limitations am I putting on myself because of my beliefs or my perspectives as a woman that a lot of times maybe aren't there, and I'm putting them up. So what are those internal, what is the community put up, what's still there that we need to work towards? So I think that's a big perspective, and I'm glad you thought of it a little bit different, Ken, because you made me think a little differently too.
Can I chime in on that?
Of course. Yes.
I don't have my black beret on, but I'm going to get a little revolutionary here, just in saying, and really following up on what George was saying, because all of this, I started out by talking about today's date, January 31st, 2025, is the 160th anniversary of the 13th Amendment being passed, and that abolished slavery, or so we hoped at the time. But the most important thing about those amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, and barrier breaking, is economics. Unfortunately, we are all wrapped inside of an economic bubble of capitalism, which, in terms of freedoms and in terms of why people come to this country, it was a freedom to start business, to, earn a living, to, obviously help your family. And I think for these barriers in tennis, equality meant we'd have not only a shot to play in these tournaments, but to actually see some reward, see some opportunity financially. That I know that's all Althea was really interested in. She wasn't trying to be the richest person in the world. She wasn't striving for fame and fortune for the sake of it. She wanted to uplift her family. And so economically, those are the barriers that we still have yet to really break through.
I think economic barriers certainly are important. And I think, obviously we know the history too of, women not being able to have credit cards or sign off on mortgages. My mom did not have that luxury. So I think the economic component is really important. And that obviously is a very deep topic that we may need a whole other feature for that particular item. But I think it is important to note that as a barrier, there are economic barriers that our communities face, and being able to participate in the sport, and that extends well beyond things like business opportunities to just simply being able to afford what we do. But I wanted to talk a little bit first about Glenn, the history, and particularly the history of the ATA and some of the other pioneers that are featured in the Breaking Barriers exhibit that the International Tennis Hall of Fame put out. And because one of the things that the ATA did was break some of those barriers or provide alternatives when those barriers were there, that at the time really provided opportunities both economically and also on the tennis court for people to play and be entrepreneurial in that way. So can you share a little bit about why that history, what the ATA did, creating the tournaments, is so important, and maybe what some of those most pivotal moments are in that history? And then, George and Ken would love to hear your perspectives as well.
Yeah, and I'll try to be succinct as you asked. But no, this is really the crux of what I was trying to say. These economic barriers, the reason for exclusion is intentional in a lot of ways, and a lot of it has to do with economics. Of course, I think one of the things I'll just refer to now is I've always talked about the fact that Althea Gibson was called the Jackie Robinson of tennis. Well, Jackie Robinson was this incredible athlete, Negro League player that Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers signed. But the critical part that I think most people don't necessarily think of, and I think this was different for the USLTA when they finally made their invitation to Althea. But Branch Rickey, altruist that he might have been, was thinking about economics. He knew if he brought the first Negro League player onto his team, he'd have a whole fan base almost to himself. And that economics was huge. To have patrons coming to the park, buying paraphernalia, buying memorabilia, spending money in concessions. So it was a huge economic, if you want to say, benefit to inclusion that is maybe little less altruistic as it is just good business sense. I mean, the Negro Leagues were great because it created this almost hospitality industry. And I don't want to jump too far forward because obviously 1916 is when the ATA was founded. And that was huge because we were being excluded, not in written form, but in practice from mainstream tennis, from the USLTA. But literally the ATA said, we're going to gather together so we can improve our craft, bring our folks together so we can challenge each other because we're not allowed to play in the mainstream tournaments. And it was done in 1916 in Washington, D.C. And that's really pivotal because that 12th Street YMCA, where it was founded, is the same location that the United Golf Association 9 years later found their organization. Once again, because of the exclusion from mainstream professional sports, we had to band together and provide opportunities. HBCUs, as we've talked about, provided a lot of the venues and opportunity to actually play those matches. But that hospitality industry that had to be created for what people used to call the Chitlin circuit, for lack of a better term, when the Negro Leagues came along. So we had to have hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, nightclubs, and that presented opportunity for entrepreneurs to build their own. But of course, that's still excluded from the real big money, of course, that we know lied in the mainstream. So I'll say 1880 to 1916, the founding of the ATA, and then we're going to move ahead to obviously 1950 when Althea Gibson got that invitation at the admonition of the ATA, who had been lobbying for years, and Alice Marble, and maybe an unsuspecting ally who was a former U.S. champion, white woman, who has an amazing story of her own for another podcast. But she wrote an amazing editorial, one that was obviously very influential. And she said, in short, if we're, what we call ourselves really ladies and gentlemen, we need to be better stewards of who we allow to play based on their talent and not on their race.
George, anything you want to add or spotlight on, like the points that either Glenn touched on or some things that were, stand out to you in terms of key moments as you've been watching tennis or involved in it?
I just think for me, really looking at the exhibit and knowing the history, really getting it out so the youngsters can understand that there is history there and they're part of it, and it didn't just start with Venus and Serena. And I mean, as Glenn said, it's amazing. It just we need to go on the mountaintop and yell it more. So
Yeah, well, for me, a couple different things also. For me personally, there was a guy named Juan Farrow that not too many people know about, but he was actually beating John McEnroe in the mid-'70s. And Juan played something called Junior Davis Cup in Poughkeepsie, New York. And that's the first time I saw a black player at that level play. And so that inspired me to realize that I could probably get to a higher level. Yannick Noah winning the French Open, that was big because internationally, blacks all over the world look up to him. In Africa, we would be in a young man's house with no windows, and all he'd have was a poster of Yannick Noah on the wall. And from that, those guys ended up being Davis Cup players and traveling around the world. So Noah, that was a really big thing. It's just our people knowing that there's a chance out there. This is what inspired me.
Awesome.
And I just got to jump in, Laura. I'm so sorry. One date that I definitely wanted to make sure I mentioned was Don Budge in 1938 as a white person, played in the ATA Nationals, which really broke that, kind of unspoken color barriers. Right. And really was the prelude, of course, to ultimately Alice Marble and the ATA getting the USLTA to make that invitation. And quite frankly, I mean, and thank God for Don Budge and, the openness that the ATA had in terms of allowing others. Of course, we had barnstorming with the Negro Leagues and Major League Baseball. So those things weren't uncommon, but it was obviously a great first step. And you really just have to tip your hat. And I definitely don't want to leave out Arthur Ashe, of course, his breakthrough as the first male African-American to win a national, or a major tournament is huge. Unfortunately, we've had a little bit of misinformation and a little bit of exclusion because most people knew about Arthur Ashe, didn't really know about Althea Gibson, and because she wasn't being promoted or highlighted, many credited Arthur Ashe for breaking the color barrier. So, and if I'm being completely honest, B.M. Clark, just to be clear, in 34, if I'm not mistaken, 24, was a Jamaican descendant person male who played in Wimbledon back in those days in the 20s, but unfortunately didn't have a breakout career of sorts. But just to give credit where credit's due.
Thank you. I want to kind of go back to the ATA and the HBCUs for a minute, because this is something that certainly have tried to learn a lot about. And George, you and I have talked a lot about this in the past years. Without the ATA and the HBCUs, a lot of the progress and the barriers that are broken would not have happened. So kind of like what you've been talking about, Glenn, and like those two organizations and overall entities were critical for, part of that history. And one of the things that I do struggle with a lot is, given the important roles that the ATA and the HBCUs played, that I don't know that they're elevated to that importance today. So, Ken and George, given your direct relationships with both the ATA, I mean, you lifetime members, longtime members of the ATA, and the fact that both of you have both worked at and played for HBCUs, why are these organizations so important, and why are we not talking about them more, and what should we be doing to support and amplify the work, the important work that they both do? Ken or George?
Karen, I'll let you open up. Yeah, we've talked about this quite often, but I mean, Ken, you can open it up, and I'll follow up with that.
All right, good. Yeah, so the ATA and the HEB, the black colleges, they work hand in hand, or they used to a lot. With the ATA years ago, when I coached at Grambling, we tried to get them to come together as different coaches around the country, like we're trying to do today, to develop more of their players so that they could play at a higher level. So it was important, if you think back to the colleges, there's always been players that are pretty good tennis players, but the black colleges was a place that maybe not the best players were, but it gave them a chance, to go to school, to play the sport. And, most of them, got their degrees and did other things. So it's very important that the colleges and the ATA come together, because Arthur Carrington was one of the first winners of the ATA, but that came out of playing for Hampton. So usually all the top players came out of the colleges, because that's where you got real training, because other players that had full-time jobs, they couldn't train as much as the college kids. So the small colleges, black colleges at the time, now we had white players at Grambling on other football teams and basketball teams, but usually tennis, it was for the player that was pretty good, coming out of communities that really didn't have the facilities to play tennis, and that's where you went to take it to the next level. So I don't think the black colleges are getting the acclaim. We were on BET in 84, and I don't think they've done any BET events. We were the first colleges ever on TV match, but I don't think they've done that since. So I think it's important for them to go hand in hand, the ATA and the colleges.
Thank you.
And that was good. And I just wanted to add too, I think, initially we know that that's where the ATA Nationals were played, at the historically black college campuses. That was where we all met, everyone met, and they were housed, they were fed. It was, it was a celebration really, for tennis and for black people at the time. It was a social thing. So it wasn't just, the ATA really didn't start out as just being a tournament. It was more social, or just as social as it was competitive. And also, I think the prestige and the opportunities at black colleges to play tennis or coach tennis weren't like they were at a lot of the white schools. The money wasn't there. The recruiting budget wasn't there. The team budget wasn't compatible with the white schools. So you would lose a lot of the, black players, especially the better black players, to a lot of these white schools that open them and welcome them and, dangle things in front of them. So I think it's not just one element. It's the whole system kind of broke down. And then years ago, a lot of the coaches that were even at HBCUs were like tough football, or they were probably the last coaches that didn't coach any of the popular sports. So a lot of them didn't have the expertise to do the high level training. And, so like I said, it was complicated. It's complicated. And I think the knowledge, even a lot of black schools don't even understand the business component of tennis. So I don't know how we can change it. I just think we have to get more involved. We have to, take it by the reins and just go at it like any other business.
George, I know you've helped us a lot when you say, what we can do. Just your thesis and the work that you've shared, which provided some solutions, and we've tried really hard to try to follow that with the tennis grant that we're offering, the program grant. But also, I think there's an education with the administrations of the schools, to your point, of how important these tennis programs are and the economic impact, but also the success factor that student athletes will have from tennis after they graduate. Football's nice, baseball's nice, basketball's nice while they're there and with NIL and all that other stuff. But when it comes to like long-term success factors, we know that tennis offers that in a way that the other sports don't. And I personally think we can do much, much more to really advocate for that on these campuses with the administration. And I know you've helped us greatly with that. Because tennis doesn't get nearly the credit for the impact it can have long term on people's ability. We talk about participating in the economy, but it opens doors. It helps you network. It is really a sport that can connect you after school for life. And I hate to see the teams that, we have young Black people that aren't playing on these teams. And so they're not getting that boost and that benefit because we don't have as many students, and then the programs are going away for men. So we may be able to keep them for women.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But then
I just wanted to add on that. I mean, with both Ken and I, we played at HBCUs, and both of those programs don't have male programs anymore. So that means a lot to me.
We're missing a lot of future George and Kens that could be coming up that we don't have now, right? And I think that is really the message when people ask, why are you so invested in supporting the HBCUs and working with them, is because the fact that you both are such forces in the tennis industry now, and that's exactly the pathway that you came through. That's really all we need to say to people. It's like, we need more Georges and Kens.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for educating me and us on that. Glenn, I wanted to turn over to you to talk about your thoughts on that, but also what other organizations outside of the ATA and the HBCUs do you think it's important for us to partner with?
Yeah, I mean, my quick comment about HBCUs, because there is so much there, and I know these guys are young. I've got more snow on the roof than most, so I'll just say we have so much to be thankful for with HBCU sports in general. Of course, coming from Grambling, Ken, I mean, Doug Williams was a huge idol for me. I always followed football, and Black quarterbacks is always a lot.
You're a Commanders fan. I expect you to say that now. This is my team.
Is my Eagles paraphernalia up?
No, you can't evoke Doug Williams and then claim another team. There's some I let slide on this podcast, but I draw the line.
The Commanders. Get them, Laura.
Hey, look. Thankfully, you guys got back on track with Jaden Daniels, so thumbs up.
Hey, it's been a long road there, Glenn. So
no, I mean, well, one of the things I definitely wanted to say is, because I mean, this was all a learning process for me as well. Althea played on the men's team. Althea Gibson, they didn't have a women's team at that time, so she played on the men's team. Advocation for Title IX, which has consumed a lot of the environment, the landscape of sports, and we should be obviously proud to support women in their quest for equality and equal opportunity to play. But it hasn't been justly doled out. Unfortunately, those numbers are really sad in the sense that you can Google it. Only 10% of college scholarships under Title IX have gone to Black women, and we know their presence, especially in many of the sports, whether it's softball or basketball, gymnastics now, which has become huge. So there's volleyball. There's so much there to be discussed. But you know, HBCUs produced everybody. Walter Payton. I mean, and I'm saying obviously these team sports, which consume, of course, a lot of the national spotlight. That's where they came from until there was integration. Until these white coaches saw that they needed to have these these spectacular athletes in order to win their games. I mean, Bear Bryant famously waited late, but he came around realizing he wasn't going to win a lot of games if he didn't have a lot of these players in tow. What HBCUs have done for tennis, and when George talks about the training, there are conferences and coaches training that takes place amongst the USPTA, which has now changed their name to a Racket Sports. I forget what the exact name is, but PTR, right. So you've got these kind of institutional training grounds, which maybe in the past haven't applied to the colleges, but they could. There could be some, because to hear George talk about the fact that we don't have certain expertise, maybe in fiduciary means or the economics of tennis. Those things can be taught, and I think if there's some devoted uh, uh, time and expertise, those things can be brought up to speed. And it'll be gradual to start, but I think there's a real opportunity there that maybe we haven't seized upon before. The other organizations with other spheres of influence, definitely in terms of our civil rights organizations, to the degree that they can be partners. Media, which is super important, especially in today's atmosphere. I think the opportunity for the HBCUs, for your USTA Florida group and the USTA in general, to partner with Anscape, to partner with some of these influencers who have podcasts, who are interested in sports, who are talking about those things. Finding that connective tissue so that we can, Bill Rhoden, who wrote $40 Million Slave, has a podcast devoted to HBCU achievement and opportunities. So, finding an opportunity to connect with him and other folks of the same ilk, I think is really a huge opportunity. Black Girls Rock, which has done a lot of great celebrating of women and their achievement. They're interested now in sports. She avoided that initially, Beverly Bond. But we have the Black Girls Tennis Club, which you guys have partnered with.
Have partnered with them.
Which is great. I joke to a degree, and I said to George, it'd be interesting if there was a Black Boys Tennis Club. Would they be so embraced? So there is some.
We would.
First, well, get to it. No, but but that, and the value of that. That is really important because, Black women have been embraced in a way, in many circumstances, in a way that boys and men haven't, and we understand those dynamics. But we do need to point out the inequity there because, as you say, Ken and George both have graduated from programs that don't have men's programs anymore. That is a crime. That is something that, and for FAMU, who's lost their men's program, we know there's some coaches who've done very well have come out of that program. So, yeah, those things are all important. And
I think you did a good job of referencing, which has come up a lot with Title IX and even the new NIL rulings, right, around, how programs can be funded. There are implications to every decision, which, if not thought through carefully, can lead to unintended consequences of that. And I think sometimes conversations like about Title IX are read like, oh, we should get rid of Title IX. And that I don't think anyone reasonable person is suggesting that. I think a lot of these women's teams, frankly, would go away without Title IX. There's going to be, we know tennis is not that revenue generator in the way some other sports are. So I think that Title IX, in many ways, we had this discussion with FAM actually up. George, you led a great panel with them up in Tallahassee, where this topic actually, they said it outright, is that for as many challenges as it presents, we wouldn't have these programs without Title IX. So it's it's a complexity there in the college landscape that everyone is dealing with in a different way. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that it is being felt acutely in terms of the HBCUs and their tennis programs. And I think that's important. And I love that you brought up the media. I think as a whole, we're trying to do more with partnering with others who care about this space. And a lot of times they're welcoming us because they never thought about sport, right? They thought about this space over here outside of sport. And then now they're like, oh, okay, we could bring in a sports component to what it means for, educational equity, right? Which is just really what we're talking about. These are educational institutions, so we want to have equity and equitable opportunity in. And sport is a component of that, but there are other entities that are really working in that space from an education side, and they could be great partners for us. And we have another podcast this month to talk about that, which is kind of exciting to me, and the media and all of the things tied to that, which I think are super important. And of course, yes, if there was, I think Jack and Jill works with young Black men, if I'm not mistaken, and their families. And I think,
Yes.
yeah, and I think that,
I was a member of Jack and Jill.
There you go, George.
Look
at you.
I'm glad that's on the record now.
That all because of my mother.
He wasn't claiming that before. No.
As far as Title IX goes, I was coaching when it started, but in the Black schools, I think it's definitely a must because the amount of scholarships and money going to the other sports, the 3 or 4 scholarships that you don't get, these schools could do that. They could have male teams. Tennis is not that expensive of a sport to run a team. So when you come up with you're getting rid of your team because of Title IX, you're just looking for an excuse. That's nonsense.
thank you for saying that, because it's also from a balance of athletes and other things, like he
Exactly.
said, we're not talking about a football team that has how many people on it, right? We're talking about small rosters.
Exactly.
And a lot of times when the schools look at, this sport doesn't generate money. I mean, football generates money, but it takes a lot. It takes probably more than it does to field a team. They're making less than it does to field a team. So it's not like they're coming out with the, I just watched that. So
Yeah, the generation of
It's
money because
complicated,
4
yeah.
schools in the country give money to all the other schools, Ohio State, all the big schools. So those small schools like Grambling, they're not making any money when you're talking about basketball. You know what I mean? So I think George is right about that. I just think the athletic directors find a way, and they're going to either the ladies are going to take the brunt of it, or the boys, smaller sports, are going to take it. But they could have these teams if the athletes wanted the team. There's no doubt. Plus, tennis players and golfers, they give back to the university. You go back into the bigger schools, they donate all the courts. They usually become doctors and lawyers, and they're going to give back. We had 250 pros coming out of Grambling football. You look at the stadium, it doesn't look like we had 250 pros. So when you look at guys giving back, that's usually tennis people and golfers.
Love that perspective. And again, I think these conversations, we have to continue to be part of it, because as the NIL starts to become more and more of the focus of these things, this is going to continue to be pushed down as the focus is more on like money and less on the experience, which, in my own personal opinion is that that's what you go for, is the experience that's going to set you up for success in life. And I think that tennis does that, extremely well in terms of those connections, what you were talking about, Ken, like professional opportunities. I'm down to like my last couple of questions, and I want to keep us on time. So Glenn, really want to go back to Althea. I think that, as you mentioned, she's oft forgotten in a lot of these discussions. And certainly this year is an important year in terms of Althea's legacy. How can the tennis community better amplify Althea's story, spotlight her achievements in both tennis and golf, which also are forgotten, and maybe use her story to inspire today's youth?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And just, like I say, thank you for this forum, because these are topics that aren't discussed often enough. Althea Gibson, for me, just became really the base of just a larger discussion that we're really having now. The fact that, I think a lot of people thought, I started this 10 years ago, and I know Rex Miller, who created this film, didn't think I'd be still doing it, I'm sure. But the importance of it, as I had a chance to work on a documentary about multicultural achievement in golf, and because she was the barrier breaker there, thankfully was able to see her get some shine in the sport that she wasn't the best at, but she was self-taught, and she was able to break through as the first LPGA African American. The critical part for Althea is that because she wasn't the vocal person that Jackie Robinson was, people kind of slighted her desire to support the community. There's only so much each of us can do. And her contribution, I think, was huge for her to learn from Dr. Johnson and Dr. Eaton. Education is key. You have to be well educated in order to succeed. Those opportunities, you say tennis presents people for a lifetime. You won't know that unless you attend a university and get a chance to get exposure to those folks. I think it's just important for everybody to know there's no straight line in success. Number one, the devotion that she had to learning her craft had to be married with education, and it also had to be sheltered in such a way by these incredible gentlemen, Dr. Johnson, Whirlwind Johnson, Dr. Eaton. There's an honoring of Black women now that hadn't been, I guess, in previous generations, and it's important to see those things. So we see Shirley Chisholm getting recognized for her political entree, and Althea was really at the precipice. And I was saying to Ray Benton earlier, her title of her book, I Always Wanted to Be Somebody. I would bet dollars to donuts Jesse Jackson took his I am somebody phrase from that book title. I would love to get a chance to ask him about that. But those influences are so important. And I think that's just part of the history that, unfortunately, whether it's Tuskegee Airmen or whether it's, other folks who weren't getting real-time recognition, Althea's life and any examination of it and her success is an important lesson for anyone who's been marginalized, for anyone who's dealing with, we know DEI is under assault right now. I mean, we're in unfortunately an atmosphere right now where inclusion is not being valued the way it should be. So this is an important story. I think it'll have a lot of value for not just the HBCU students, but anyone who's interested in seeing a more inclusive society and equality really having the kind of breadth it should have in 2024. So I'm very excited about hopefully doing the screenings with some of your partners in Florida.
One of the things that I appreciated about the documentary when I watched it, which I took away from it, and I hope that the young people who see it, whether they're college students or others, is that Althea didn't play by anybody's rules, which I really liked about her. And I think if you look at the differences in how she approached life, I think her dad teach her to be a boxer, and she had this very combative type of style at times that could rub people the wrong way. And you just mentioned some of her story, like the traditional pathway that sometimes we sell to kids on how to be successful. She didn't follow any of that, really. She was a very unique individual, and sometimes that hurt her, but she still was that person. And I think there's a lot to be said about somebody who's true to themselves and genuine and follows their own path, regardless of whatever societal pressure and where that's coming from. It can be coming from a lot of different places. And I think, the documentary talks about her being lonely. I think Angela talks about that in the documentary, is that, thinking she was lonely at times sort of later in life and didn't have a lot of friends. And I think there's a lot of young people out there that really struggle with that. I see that happening with people being lonely and feeling like outcasts and not fitting in, and particularly with social media and things. And so I think there's a lot to take away from Althea that transcends tennis. transcends every community, and it's sort of like the human experience. So I appreciate you saying that, Glenn, is that anybody that's felt that way, felt alone, felt marginalized, felt, criticized or, unique or different in any sort of way. And that really came through in the documentary. So I can't say enough about how much I watch a lot of documentaries, and there was just a human component to it that I don't know that I expected, but really I found very refreshing and inspiring to me. So I'm going to make my next question my last question because we are running out of time today. And this one is for George and Ken. What are some other ways that we can work to educate and inspire the young people in our local efforts? And I know the two of you focus very, very heavily on this in Gainesville. So we'd love to hear your perspective about how can we inspire the young people in the Black community through our local efforts, whether that's tennis or anything else.
Okay. I think for me, it's really just go out there and make it happen. Go out there and, indulge yourself and don't stand from the sideline. Just yesterday, going to one of our programs that we partner with, they was my first day with this group, and Ken normally does that. So I was able to tell them, my background, and, they were kind of unruly. And then I explained to them what I was giving up and what I was sacrificing to be there, and that I didn't have to do it. And then they kind of opened up and they were receptive. So, and I think they saw that I at least cared being out there. So for us, we really care. I know I don't want to speak for Ken, but we don't necessarily do this for the money. It's because tennis was part of our life, and we want to share it with youngsters coming up.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, we definitely not doing it for the money, or I'd go sell cars or something like that. But I think things we can do is, take them to high school matches, college matches, pro events, tournaments, so they can see people like them playing, or people, get comfortable outside the community. Our first goal is to get them comfortable and back on the courts inside their community and get a little confidence. And so once we get them with confidence, then I think we can send them out against each other, and then they'll feel good about being there, So like George says, he's the disciplinarian, and when he hits there, right? And taking them where they... Yeah, I'm the fun guy, and that's if I'm the fun guy, that's a bad time. So if I'm the fun guy, so it's and meeting them where they are, because in Africa I made the same mistake. I kept telling the kids that they could, get Mercedes and do this. They had no idea what I was talking about from where they came, right? They were underprivileged. I should have been telling them about getting a new pair of shoes, So I got to meet them where they are and then bring them where we've been, if possible.
Exactly.
Love that. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. We covered a lot of things today. I think one of the common themes that I took away is that, one, you have to care. And it's clear that you all care a lot. And I think that that's the ask here is to care, that there are a lot of reasons historically why we don't have better growth and better resources and better support, but we are able to change that and have an impact when we care. And I'm excited that I get to work with each of you in different ways, certainly to celebrate Althea this year, but also to improve the opportunities and access that our students have, whether they're out in the local community or through our HBCUs. And I would, I'm comfortable saying that wouldn't be happening if you weren't here with us. So Ken, I'm glad you're not selling cars. Thank you for deciding to be here with us instead. And George, always a pleasure. And Glenn, it's been great to get to know you over the past year. And looking forward, we have some exciting events for February, which we're going to talk more about in our next podcast. We have an exciting opportunity with a partner, a national partner, to really elevate this discussion for HBCUs to a nationwide level. which is great. And then we also are planning an upcoming event with Bethune-Cookman at the end of February, thanks to George and our partners there. So stay tuned for more information on that. But today, thank you all for sharing your wisdom. I greatly appreciate it.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I add one thing? I
Yes,
just
sir.
wanted to say, and I'll speak for all of us, that I think it starts from the top, and I definitely know that if USTA Florida didn't have your leadership and have you behind it, because I know you do care, and I just like to thank you for that.
Yes, for sure. 100%.
Definitely
My
have to
pleasure.
echo that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot to me. So thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That's all for this edition of the Here to Serve podcast. Thanks for tuning in. For more episodes of the Here to Serve podcast, including upcoming topics, dates, and guests, visit USTAFlorida.com/here to serve.